All right, so today I'm going to be talking about just a general introduction to research. And of course, this is part of the Research Basic Science series and is intended just to give you a start as to what it is when we use the term research. So in terms of a general outline, the first thing I'm going to talk about is what is research, give you a nice formal definition. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the scientific method. Then I'm going to talk about some general approaches to research. And then I'll end talking about the types of research that's available within the medical school. So to start off, what is research? Well, this is something that there actually is a formal definition for, something that the US government has defined for us. And according to 45 CFR 46.102, paragraph D, research is a systematic investigation, so the gathering and analysis of information that is designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. So it's a process to discover new information. If we don't want to take 45 CFR 46.102D's definition, we can also look to the National Academy of Sciences, and they define research as the object, or the objective of research is to extend human knowledge of the physical, biological, or social world beyond what is already known. So that's sort of a formal definition of research. So if you say formally that I'm going to research that, what you mean is you're going to engage in a systematic inquiry to provide information to solve problems or increase our understanding of the world in general and the phenomenon under study utilizing the cornerstone of every science known as the scientific method. If you say that I'm going to research that more colloquially or informally, what you're saying is, I'll read a book, I'll Google it, I'll ask someone that knows. That's not the type of research that we're talking about here. What we're talking about is this formal process. So as I had mentioned, the formal process heavily relies on something called the scientific method. And I don't have a lot of time to go into the details. So very quickly, the scientific method is the structure by which we formulate essentially all formal research. And what we start off with is observations. And those observations result in a hypothesis. You can think of a hypothesis as an informed and educated prediction or explanation of some phenomenon that you choose to study. These hypotheses are what are going to guide the research. So it allows us to decide what factors are important, how they might relate to each other, and begin to bring to mind how might manipulations affect things in your study, guided by these hypotheses. Once you come up with your hypotheses, now you have data collection going on, and that data is collected to interpret ultimately whatever it is you're looking at, and you are framing your data collection and then interpretation based on the hypotheses, allowing for the making of sound conclusions. So if we look at this in another way graphically, we start off with observations about the world or whatever area we are interested in studying, and those observations lead to questions. Next, once you have those questions, you typically search the literature to see, well, maybe those questions have been answered already. Science has been around for a long time. Research has been around for a long time. What do we know about this topic already? Once we have an idea of what's currently known, then we can generate our hypotheses. And this is largely going to be based on that previous research. Based on what I know about this thing, this is what I think would happen. We then create an experiment that is, again, a formal way of investigating whatever or testing those hypotheses. We form our experiment and then collect our data. Based on our data, we come up with conclusions. We then share those results. In terms of medical research, for example, we may use this to develop interventions. And then ultimately, we ask new questions, and then the process starts all over again. And these last few boxes are really important and often things that we forget about. So research is not a static thing. We're always learning more about the topics that we are researching, which is great. It keeps people like myself having a job, but at the same time, it means that it never really ends because there's always, after that sharing of results, a modification of the hypotheses, perhaps new theories come along that then require some new questions to be generated and then to test those. So some important characteristics of research that's using the scientific method that I really want to highlight is, firstly, it's empirically verifiable. And by that, what I mean is it's supported by the data. This is not the type of thing where you have a gut feeling about the outcome of the research and you put that forth. You have to have the data to back that up. It's also very important that it's shared and made public. It's certainly the case that by making research public, getting it out into the world, it advances research as a whole. It advances our general knowledge of the world because it allows others to look at your data, look at your conclusions, and then perhaps modify them. Maybe they don't disagree, or maybe they don't see things the same way as you do, and then they may generate their own hypotheses and studies and collect data and then make that available, and that's really how the fields are pushed forward. Similarly, it's always tentative. So like I said in the last slide, it's not like once you're done a research project and you publish that paper, that's it. That area of research stops. I'm done with it, good. It is constantly under review by both yourself, the people that were involved in the research, and others who read it. And then, of course, it's ethically neutral. And this is sort of a weird concept to explain, but one that I'm sure we intuitively know what that means. So it's not guided by our ethical principles. It's not that we think that this research should turn out a certain way based on our ethical beliefs, and therefore it's correct. It's agnostic in terms of the ethics associated with it. It's all about the data. What does that support? So next I'm going to talk about the types of research that are available, and one common way to break down types of research are based on its purpose. And this can lead you to breaking down, firstly, fundamental research or lab work, pure research, basic sciences. There's a lot of terms for it, that's the first category. And then the second is applied research. And applied research can be evaluative. It can be oftentimes acting upon what we've learned from basic science, but its general definition means that it has clinical or societal impacts associated with it. And then the third type that I'll very quickly talk about is correlational research, which you'll see in a moment. So starting with fundamental research, as its name suggests, fundamental research provides a foundational knowledge that is often generalizable. In fact, it's usually the source of the ideas and the methods and the theories that are later used in what's called translational research or applied research. So we start with the basic sciences, with our fundamental research, and then what we learn from that can be applied to various settings. An important caveat with that, with regards to fundamental research, is that the obvious commercial value of the discoveries that are coming out of it are often absent. So the motivation here is typically a scientist's curiosity or interest in this specific scientific question. It's not necessarily intended to create or to invent something. And that's an important distinction between fundamental research and applied research. As we'll see, applied or translational research is scientific study that aims to solve real-world problems. So these problems could be something like curing illness, developing some new technology, improving efficiencies of existing either treatments or devices. But there's a real-world application to the results of that research. And like I had said in the previous slide, it usually takes the methods, ideas, and theories from basic research, what we learn from those settings, and then translate it. You've probably heard the term from bench to bedside, translates it into a bedside application in medical research. So what we learn from the bench is taken and applied to the patient's bedside, from bench to bedside. The third type that I highlighted was correlational research. This is typically non-experimental research. So you're not actually getting in there and manipulating variables or anything, but you are studying the relationship between two variables with the help of statistical analyses. So it is utilizing statistical approaches to examine, but what you're primarily interested in doing is quantifying the strength between things. It does not typically allow for explanations of causation or the examination of extraneous variables or more complicated scenarios. It's simply and quite often just looking at the strength between these two things. How are they related? So the example that I love to give about this is ice cream and crime rates. So you can go now and you can verify everything that I'm talking about, but it's entirely true that ice cream and crime rates are highly correlated with one another. As one goes up, so does the other. So if we were to perform a correlational research study looking at ice cream and crime rates, we would show that these two variables are associated. There is a relationship between them. The important thing that you want to keep in mind is that correlational research doesn't allow us to address causation. So in the example that I gave, it's not the case that because these two things are related that one is causing the other, or it may not be. So maybe it's true that there's nothing better after getting a nice ice cream cone than going out and committing crimes. That would be a causation. Ice cream causes crime rates. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe after you commit crime, there's nothing better than having an ice cream cone to celebrate your deviousness. And that would also be a causative relationship. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference between those using a correlational research approach. You just see that these two things are related. What actually is going on here is season. So ice cream doesn't cause crime, and crime doesn't cause you to want ice cream. The actual relationship is both ice cream sales and crime rates increase during the summer when it's warmer. No one wants to go out and eat an ice cream cone when it's minus 40 degrees out. Similarly, no one wants to go out and commit crime when it's minus 40 degrees out. You just want to stay in your house and be nice and warm. So in this example, there's a third variable there, season or temperature, that is impacting both ice cream and crime rates. And if you just perform correlational research, you may miss that altogether because you're just looking at the strength of association between these two things. So next I'm going to talk about the general approaches to research. And now instead of by separating it by the goal of the research, we're going to separate it by the methods that are used. And those methods are qualitative and quantitative. With qualitative research, what we're doing is examining phenomena that are difficult or impossible to quantify mathematically using numbers. So this could involve the analysis of non-numerical data, so things like words or pictures or objects or opinions or people's beliefs. Things that are really difficult to attach a number to, and then to run it through some statistical analysis. In comparison, quantitative research is the analysis of numerical data and relationships, and it involves the collection of empirical data, data that you can attach numbers to. Now, it's important to note that both qualitative and quantitative research can utilize the scientific method. And by that, I mean they can both result from the generation of models, theories, and hypotheses. You can have experimental control in both cases. You can manipulate variables in both cases. You can model and you can analyze the data, and then you can evaluate that analyzed data to refine and evaluate your hypotheses. So you can engage in the full scientific method, whether you're doing qualitative or quantitative research. And this is certainly an important point to get across. Oftentimes, especially when you're in the hard sciences, so myself, I'm a neuroscientist. Oftentimes when people think about qualitative versus quantitative research, they would say quantitative research, for example, neuroscience, that's a real science. Qualitative research where you're engaging in surveys and asking people their opinions, that's more of a soft science. That doesn't really count. Well, it does count. You can apply the scientific method to both types, both qualitative and quantitative research methodologies. You can also use them together in what's known as a mixed design, qualitative and quantitative. You can figure out what that means, but essentially you're taking aspects of both and putting them together. So what I'd like to spend the rest of the time talking about are specific applications of these different research methodologies for medical students. So both qualitative and quantitative research opportunities are available within the Stanford School of Medicine, and I'll talk about at the end where you may first turn to get some of these research experiences, but I thought I should give examples of qualitative research and quantitative research to give you an idea as to which of these may be of more interest to you. So qualitative research can be things like case studies, phenomenological research, narrative research, grounded theory, ethnographic, and historical. And I'll talk about what each of those are, because I'm sure some of these are terms or types of research that you've never encountered before. Now, case studies are probably the most common and probably are something that you've encountered before. So this is where you are usually working with a clinician that has come across some interesting case. A patient has come through their door that for some reason they think, hey, this is important, we should let the world know about this patient. What this involves is an in-depth description and analysis of the case. Maybe it's cases, maybe there's a few patients that they've come across, but the idea is to reduce the unit of analysis into a single event, program, activity, or illness. So instead of researching everything about this topic, you're using a single case to highlight things that you think are important about that topic. So an example could be as follows. The perceptions of a post-stroke sexuality in a woman of childbearing age was explored using a qualitative case study approach by Baugh and Millenbruch. So semi-structured interviews, so they're not collecting data, they're not taking numerical analyses, they're just engaging in what are called semi-structured interviews, so interviews that have a specific format that were used with a 36-year-old mother of 2 children with a history of acute ischemic stroke. So this is just one patient. 36 years old, she had an ischemic stroke, and now they're asking her questions about how this has affected her life. The data were analyzed using an inductive approach. So they are applying scientific methods to what they are capturing, but of course it's different than if this was a quantitative study. The types of analyses that you can do on qualitative research are different than what you can do on quantitative research, but you can still do things with them. Based on that analysis, the author concluded that stroke during childbearing years may affect a woman's perception of herself as a sexual being and her ability to carry out gender roles. And here's the reference for that study if you want to look more into it. But here we're highlighting, based on this single case, this 36-year-old woman who had these acute ischemic events are now being used to highlight some of the impacts that that experience can have. In this case, her perceptions of her own sexuality. But it's a single case study. Hey, this patient had this thing happen, and these were the results. Now, this can be used to guide future research. It may be used to actually develop hypotheses, testable quantitative research may come from this, where now you want to look at, well, what components of this experience resulted in the downstream effects and actually test these things. But in this case, you're just saying, hey, this is a case that we came across, and this is the description associated with it. Phenomenological research, here the goal is to understand people's experiences and capture, for lack of its better term, its essence. So here we're examining individuals that have had similar experiences of the phenomenon under study. So you can see it's similar to a case study, but also has some important differences. So an example here is a phenomenological study conducted by Cornelio et al. That aimed at describing the lived experiences of mothers parenting children with leukemia. So here we're looking to understand what it's like, the experience of parenting a child with leukemia. And they used data from 10 mothers. They also used semi-structured interviews and then analyzed it, again, using a method specific to qualitative types of studies, in this case, Herschel's method of phenomenology. And from that analysis, themes came out. Like, this is a pivotal moment in my life. There is the theme of the experience of being with a serious ill child, having to keep distance with the relatives, overcoming financial and social commitments, and so on. So all of these themes come out that help you understand people's experience and capture its essence. And here is the reference for that if you want to look more into it. Narrative research, again, sort of similar. focuses on exploring the life of an individual to tell their story. If you think about the narrator of a story, a narrative research is essentially having the person tell their story to you. And it's used to convey an individual's experience to a larger audience. So for example, Carlson et al. Undertook a narrative inquiry to explore how people with Alzheimer's disease present their life story. So if you have Alzheimer's disease and you give your story, what does that look like? Data were collected from 9 participants, and they were simply asked to describe their life experiences from childhood to adulthood, then to current life, and their views about their future life. So create a story about what your life was like, what it's like now, and how you think it's going to be in the future. And that's going to allow us to really get a better understanding on what that individual's experience is like and get that out to a larger audience, which again, in a clinic can be really important. So what is it like to be told that you have this terminal diagnosis? What is it like to be told that you have this condition that there's no treatment available for, and eventually, all of these negative things may happen to you? It's important for us to be able to know these things. This is one way where you can get at it. Grounded theory research is used to discover or generate the theory in the context of the process being studied. So here the emphasis really is on theory generation and development. And as you can probably tell from its name, there's 2 things here: grounded theory. So we have the theoretical side, and we also have the grounded side. And what we mean by that is that we can ground theoretical assumptions with collected data. So it's sort of like empirical quantitative data that's used to support a hypothesis, but in this case, it's qualitative data that's used to ground the hypothesis, and that may become clearer with an example. So Williams et al. Conducted a grounded theory research to explore the nature of the relationship between the sense of self and eating disorders. So they collected data from 11 women that had anorexia nervosa, and based on that collected data, they developed a theoretical framework on the relationship between self and anorexia nervosa. And now that theoretical framework, we would say, is grounded based on the experiences of those 11 women that data was collected from. And again, you can take this qualitative research and actually use it to generate predictions and hypotheses that result in quantitative study. But to start off, this is a great way to develop that first theory. Ethnographic research. Here, what you're doing is narrating and interpreting the health behaviors of a culture sharing group. What do I mean by culture sharing group? This is a group of individuals that share some common meanings, customs, or experiences. So this could be something like a group of physicians working on tribal land. They're all experiencing the same sort of thing. It could be medical students in a specific class. So maybe people think that the nervous system's block is perhaps more horrible than all of the others. I'm going to pick on the nervous system's block since that's the one that I teach, but maybe we want to look at medical students that are in this class and get an idea as to their behaviors as it relates to something health related. So, maybe we would think that during the nervous system's block, students don't have time to engage in activities that make them happy. They're stuck studying the brain the entire 8 weeks. So we could look at medical students in that specific class. You may have an interest in patients that received a particular home-based rehabilitation. So again, the behaviors of a culture sharing group and looking at how that impacts whatever it is that you're studying. So they largely also utilize interviews, recordings, and document reviews to come up with the conclusions. So what's an example? Here we're talking about an ethnographic study by LeBaron et al. That was used to explore the barriers to opioid availability and cancer pain management in India. So it's a very specific group of individuals, cancer patients within this region in India, that are going to share common meanings, customs, or experiences, and then utilizing interviews, recordings, and documented reviews, they are going to identify significant barriers by engaging in what's called open coding and thematic analysis of the interview process to then figure out what it's like to be a member of this group. In this case, it's individuals within this region in India that are obviously undergoing cancer treatment and may or may not have the open availability of opioids to tackle or to combat that cancer pain. So what is that experience like for this group? And then lastly, we have historical research in terms of our different types of qualitative research. So historical research is the systematic collection and evaluation of historical evidence that's used to gain insights from the past to interpret events of the present. So these can be collected from primary and secondary source material. So primary would be things like diaries, writings, firsthand interviews. Secondary sources could be things like textbooks from the time, newspaper articles from the time, or second or third hand accounts of what's going on. And what you typically see here are descriptions of what happened, how it happened, and why it happened, with the goal of extending these conclusions to current medical practice. So an example here is a study by Baugh in 2019, where they analyzed the breastfeeding trends in 3 countries, Sweden, Ireland, and the United States, using a historical qualitative method. Through analysis of historical data, the users found that strong family policies, adherence to international recommendations, and adoption of baby-friendly hospital initiatives could greatly enhance breastfeeding rates. So by looking historically at the impact that these things had on breastfeeding rates, you can make conclusions about current medical practice and say, these are the things that we should do if we want this outcome. So that would be historical research. All right, now for the last few slides, we're going to talk about quantitative research, and we'll go through this pretty quickly because we've already talked about quantitative research a fair bit already. But this can be benchtop research, translational research, clinical research. It can be educational research. I won't talk about that today just for time constraints, but that can also be quantitative. But we'll start off with benchtop research. Again, this is something that we've already touched on. You may hear this referred to as basic science, as preclinical, pure research, fundamental research. It gets its name because it's usually conducted literally at a bench. You are standing there and you are pipetting, or you're running gels, or you're doing biochemistry, all wet lab sorts of things. The goal here is to improve scientific theories for a better understanding and ability to predict. You create hypotheses to refute or support theories that can explain observed phenomenon. Remembering back to that scientific method, these can be exploratory, they can be descriptive, they can be explanatory. But the goal is to generate these hypotheses and then test them using these very basic science types of methods. And this information, what we learn from these types of studies, is used to generate the ideas, principles, and theories not immediately utilized for clinical work, but forms the basis of progress towards clinical utility. So it lays the foundation, hence its name, of fundamental research for future clinical studies. And to give a little bit more context to this, if we go from basic research all the way to clinical research, there are actual formal definitions of different stages along the spectrum. So at T0, we have the basic biomedical or lab discoveries, and then at T4, all the way on the other end, we have improvements in the health of broad populations. So very clinical in nature, and then very basic in nature, and you have things in between. And in between, we have what's called translational research. So translational research is research that's aimed at converting basic research into research that directly benefits humans. So it's a type of applied research where we are going from those basic lab discoveries, and perhaps we're using it, so we figure something out in a petri dish, now we apply it in an animal model and we see if it holds true. So that's a little more translational. Then once we've done our animal models, maybe we perform clinical trials and testing of efficacy. Once we've done those clinical trials, we move on to a broader use on perhaps a diverse range of patients. And then we move on to, in this case, instead of just at a single hospital, what about across the Dakotas? How does this research apply? And then ultimately, how does it apply to the broad population So how does it apply to everyone? So we have population translational research, practice translational research, human translational research, and then what's called preclinical, which is, again, the basic sciences. But you can see how this sort of builds. So clinical research is aimed at determining the safety and efficacy, things like medications, medical devices, diagnostic products, treatment regimens. Most often we see this in the form of clinical trials, which also have phases 1 through 4 that scale up as you go. So you start off with, again, proof of concept in animal models all the way up to looking at this in large populations of humans. So it's important to note that clinical research is different than clinical practice. Clinical research is looking to figure out what ultimately can make it into clinical practice. In clinical practice, established treatments are what are being used. So it's treatments that have gone through clinical research, phase 4 clinical trials, et cetera, and are now established. We know how they work, we know when they work, and now they are established treatments that are used. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about is just, if you want to get involved in research and you know what type of research you want to do, where are the best places to go? Well, basic science research, if you're interested in that pre-translational research, research at the bench types of things, obviously, you probably know that within the medical school, there is a division of basic biomedical science. This is where you should first turn if you're interested in basic science research. Of course, both Sanford and Avera do engage in basic science research as well. Most of it at Sanford is conducted in Sanford Research, so the basic science wing of the Sanford Health System. And then Avera also has research institutes like the Institute for Human Genetics, et cetera, that are involved in basic science research, and you can approach those locations as well. For translational research, there are a few researchers, such as myself, that are housed in basic biomedical sciences that engage in translational research, so you can certainly start off looking there, but then Sanford Research, Avera Research Institutes, and Monument Health out on the west side of the state all are involved in translational research. When it comes to clinical research now, since you're largely looking at patient populations, these are going to be our health sites. So our clinical sites at Sanford, Avera, and Monument. Qualitative research, if you were listening to those descriptions and thought, yeah, that's really the thing that I want to do, I'm not interested in basic science or clinical research, I'm more interested in qualitative research. Perhaps you want to look at education research. Well, a lot of that is going on outside of our clinical campuses. So the primary exception to that, of course, are case studies. So if you're interested in case studies, this is going to be likely done in collaboration with one of the clinical campuses. But if you're interested in the other types of qualitative research, this is usually done outside of the medical school. So it may be the School of Business, it may be the School of Health Sciences, maybe the psychology department, these areas that are all involved in research that touches on health-related issues, but often take the more qualitative approach rather than quantitative. But the big take home here is, once you have identified a potential mentor, certainly feel free to send them an email. Say what it is that you like about their research. Say, oh, I was on your website, or I saw your paper, or whatever the case may be, and I really have interests in whatever you're interested in. I'd love to arrange a time to chat about the potential for me to be involved in some of that research. Largely, scientists and clinicians are rather egotistical, and we love to hear how great our stuff is. So if you start off by saying, oh, I really enjoyed your paper, or I really think what you do is cool, we're probably going to listen to you and want to hear all of the reasons why you think what we do is great, and then perhaps get you involved in that research. Now, I realize that it may be difficult to know who's doing research at the various campuses and how to get in touch with them. Luckily, we do have an individual, Nikki, that many of you may know, that is our medical student research coordinator. So certainly send her an email and she can go out and help you, put you in contact with individuals at the various clinical campuses or within the basic sciences or even across campus to first get your foot in the door with the type of research that you're interested in. So in summary, again, this is just a very, very quick overview of research as a whole, but what you should be able to take from this is medical research is very broad. There really should be a type of research to suit everyone's interests, whether you like conducting interviews or you like pipetting or anything in between. There's going to be an opportunity to do that. And it really depends on what your interests are. The one thing that I want to stress is that depending on your specific background and the type of research that you're interested in, there could be a very steep learning curve involved. So you should not expect over a summer to be able to become involved in research that results in a publication. While that does happen, it's far more likely that that just gets you down the road and start your research process to the point of getting those publications or getting those presentations. It takes a long time. So I would certainly recommend that the earlier you start contacting people, the better the chances are that you have a completed research project that you can then talk about when you go on your residency interviews. Because the next few years will go by very quickly. And the sooner you can get started, and the sooner you can get involved in research, the more likely you are to have a research project that you can talk about in the future. So if you have any questions, certainly feel free to contact myself. My email address is pretty easy to find. Same thing with Nikki. You can certainly contact her, and we will do what we can to get you involved in research. And I think I have a few more of these lectures to generate as the introduction to research types of the research series continues. So you'll probably be hearing from me again in the future. Thank you.